At the Newark airport, he had been on a transatlantic long voyage from Africa with some other adopted kids. And he was put in our arms. We thought he was 3 years old. Turned out he was older, but he looked up at us, smiled this very charming smile, and continued to do that. And we went to a nearby hotel and picked it up.
Well, when they put him in our arms, it was almost uncanny because he didn't blink, he didn't have any adverse reaction. He absolutely looked straight up at me, and I held him and I had a blanket and I had it around him because it was a chilly night. And he just looked at me and he smiled this big, great big grin, and I had no idea at the time. I mean, he was darling, absolutely beautiful, but he was beginning, his process of charming us in the biggest way possible, and of course it worked. It was great. So we took and we had our other, one other youngest child with us whom we had taken to the airport, and we took them to a hotel, and he was wired. He was really wide awake, and so we let them jump on the bed a little bit, and we let them try on pajamas, and he loved clothes. We knew, he'd never had clothes of his own, so he was very proud of his onesie, and we let them take a bath, and he slowly settled down. But literally from the very start, it was all about him making sure that we were completely charmed by him. And when I think back on that, that's not a reaction that I would expect a child to have. But that's absolutely what he did. It was quite remarkable. He seemed very, very much in control of himself the whole time. And there was no fear, and there was no worry or anxiety or anticipation. It was just, I'm going to make sure that these people just absolutely love me.
I think there were probably all those things present, but his way of dealing with that, as we later found out as a kid with attachment issues, was to try to get the adult in charge on his side as quickly as he could.
Right. So we flew back here the very next morning, and that seemed fine. But then the first night home, when we were here in our house and we were trying to set some kind of a normal schedule, we put him to bed, and we put our other kids to bed, and he didn't want to go to bed, and he proceeded to scream and yell and cry and kick and fight literally for 4.5 hours. And I'm not exaggerating. I have 6 children. I know how hard it is to get a little person to bed occasionally, but this was 4.5 hours straight, and I'd never seen a kid do anything like that either. It was amazing. He tried to outlast both Rick and I, and I think we were spelling off, and he did it, but it was just the most remarkable thing long into the night, way into the night.
So how long did this go on before you knew something was not right, something was different?
Well, honestly, we knew that pretty much right away. Then it was a 10-year quest to figure out what that was. Mm-hmm. And, going to many professionals and not getting answers. He had trouble in preschool right away. He had continued to have trouble at home, and then in elementary school, and so we began to try to find therapists and people who could figure out what this was. We never even heard the word attachment probably for 4 years after he came, which is pretty remarkable in hindsight, particularly since he was an adopted kid and a foreign adoption, and it's so prevalent as an issue there. And we live in a very educated community with lots of therapists, but never even heard the word. Nobody suggested that this was something we should pursue, but we knew something was going on. Mm-hmm. But he burned through several private therapists who didn't have a clue. School, was trying to cope in every way they could. Great teachers, very dedicated. In elementary school, he spent most of his time down at the principal's. They were good friends, and she was the powerful one in the school, so he used to like to go down there and just hang out in the office. But he couldn't sit in class, and he was very disruptive in class, so it took us a long time. I'm maybe getting ahead of your question, but we knew something was wrong, we just had no idea what for quite a while.
So how did you first learn about the term attachment disorder?
I don't remember, you?
Oh, I don't know, but we read everything we could find online, of course, about adoptions and kids who came from difficult circumstances. We didn't know what his circumstances were. We just knew he had been on the streets of Addis Ababa for a number of years. We thought 3 years, and probably it was more like 5 years. When he got to the orphanage in Addis Ababa, it was, I think it was probably difficult for them even then because the police had found him on the streets. He seemed to have no family, no one around him. And they picked him up and took him to the orphanage and dropped him off. Here's another child who was abandoned. And they said, one of the foster moms told one of our other children who came later, when she saw a picture of him, they said that was the little boy who cried more than any little boy we had ever had. He just cried continuously. And we heard about that long after. But he didn't know his name, and he was probably 5 years old and didn't know his own name. Maybe didn't have one or hadn't had one for a long time. Nobody knew, who his people were or what had happened to him. He was just abandoned. So, very difficult beginning. And, he had, they were pretty quiet about how he was at the orphanage, but he was there less than a year, and then we got him, and he seemed very hyper alert, focused, bright, seemed bright as all get out. Was a backseat driver. I thought he was 3, and he didn't speak a word of English, and we'd be driving, and he would be shouting, red light and stop sign and look out. And I'm a good driver, but he would shout from the backseat continuously. He was so worried about things like driving. He was hyper alert to the sounds of traffic, and this is a quiet neighborhood, but he would go rushing out if he heard a car or a truck. Fascinated by large vehicles, fascinated by people in uniform. We sometimes have wondered, what kinds of relationships he had with police or whoever, because he was always fascinated by cops and anybody else in a uniform. Very interesting to him. So he had this curious background, and we weren't sure, we had no information, weren't sure what it was all about, but little bits of this comes popping out when you're getting to know your child, and it's most curious. It's different than other kids in a big way.
I remember once we came across the term attachment, started reading about it, for both of us, the lights just lit up. We said, yeah, this is him. And we came across that behavior scale. I don't remember the name of it, but where you rate your child's behaviors and then you get a score, and he came up way up on that.
Reactive.
So,
what were those behaviors that resonated with you the most?
Charming in public,
Yeah.
Making friends with absolutely everybody, willing to go off with people that he'd never seen before and didn't know.
Ability to disrupt his class and family, and talking incessantly.
Yeah, non-stop talking, almost like he just had to hear his own voice all the time, non-stop talking. The ability to disrupt is a remarkable thing, because I think people use that term pretty easily, And until you've really seen a kid with serious attachment disorder, you have no idea what a child like this can do. And put our son in a classroom every single year, 20, 25, 30 children. He will have all of the children, I'm talking about all of the children, watching him, and he will be in the center. And he will, within 5 or 10 minutes, have a teacher standing in the background, truly having no idea how to change this dynamic. And he completely would ignore all verbal cues, any kind of instruction, and he would simply make sure that everyone was focused on him. And every single year he was in school, we would have wonderful, experienced, marvelous teachers by anyone's standards calling and saying to us day after day and week after week, I don't know what to do with him. I don't know what to do with him. I've never seen a child like this in 15, 20, 25 years. I heard that for years of elementary school. When a kid, I think, has real attachment disorder, and he simply ignores all verbal cues from teachers, principals, other parents, everyone, there's not a lot that the adults around him can do.
And he couldn't, in hindsight, we know now, but he couldn't form relationships. He had one teacher in the 3rd grade that he did like, and she just slowed it down and made a connection. So it was tenuous, but that was as close as he ever came to having any success in school. And he was able to stay in class a little longer, and that was success by our standards, but it was difficult to replicate, never replicate it again, and he just couldn't hack it in school. So those were some of the things. At home he continued to drive his sister crazy. She would just put her hands over her ears and scream so that she didn't have to deal with him. It was her way of just, get me away from him. Just drove her crazy.
What would he do?
He would just be after her, little ways, just bugging, and trying to make sure he was in control of whatever the play situation, the food situation, anything. He had to be in control of it. And he just wouldn't stop. He was just always at her and just drove her crazy.
So the teachers didn't know what to do, and you didn't know what to do. So what did you do?
Well, took him to several therapists. One had some success as a play therapist, and Dante was able to form a relationship with this guy, and I don't know if his behaviors changed a lot, but he did like going to him, and there was a little bit of progress there. He was still young then, in 3rd or 4th grade. Then he moved on to others, and he just would just walk out of the sessions. So we weren't getting any help really there from therapists, and that just continued. He spiraled down in school. When he hit middle school, when he hit puberty, which was actually in the 4th, 5th grade, because he was actually older than they had told us. So then we bumped him up and put him in middle school, skipped a grade, which was the school's recommendation, because they said he's age appropriate, we need him to be with his age group, and he's not doing anything in school anyway, so we'll keep him in the middle school. But he really burned and crashed there. Ended up in a day treatment school, which they have in Boulder County, which is a great idea, but doesn't work. It didn't work for our kid with attachment, because they couldn't handle him any better. So really we got quite desperate, just didn't know what direction to turn. And then he got into some trouble with the law, so he fell into the probation and the court system. Not unusual. He was drinking and substances and trying to take care of his problems that way. And then a therapist that the court had ordered that he use had a friend in social services and Forrest had done a presentation to Boulder Social Services, so we heard about Forrest that way. Looked up the website, read about him, called him up, made an appointment, and took Dante up to see the psychiatrist first, and then Forrest showed up there, and then we went right down to the institute. So we got a diagnosis of bipolar, and the same day went down to the institute, and by the skin of our teeth got Dante to agree, with a lot of help from his probation officer and a lot of patience from Forrest and his staff, to go into the program. He thought it was just going to be a month, turned into a year. But, I think the one thing that struck me, and that I want to make sure that anybody with such a kid knows, is that, is the mental health overlay to this. Because we started looking, once we found out about attachment, we looked at everything through the attachment lens. And we didn't have an awareness, neither did the therapist, that this kid could have a mental illness. And once the psychiatrist, who was very experienced at differentiating attachment from ADHD, from bipolar, saw it, and he said right away, this kid's severely bipolar. He needs to get on meds. And, within a couple of weeks of getting on meds, it calmed down. I mean, his problems didn't disappear because he had behaviors that he had been inculcated for 12 years, but you could get through that outer layer of the bipolar and all of the stuff that was putting up for him. So that's just so important. Mm-hmm. Just changed everything in terms of getting Dante able to accept therapy.
And once he was able to accept therapy, what was different at the Institute than the previous therapy he had gotten?
Well, everything, really. I mean, the fact that it was inpatient, but not just that. It's the way that's done. Having him have this practice family. If you had him in this milieu with our family and you were doing all the same things, I just don't think it would have worked, because there was too much emotional baggage there for him. Too scary to try to do those things with us. But he could do them with these strangers. Mm-hmm. And because they were so well trained, and they just kept him very narrowly confined at first, and then he had to earn his privileges, and he was motivated to do that, and it was so structured, and just led him right through that he began to calm down, feel some success.
But it took a long time.
We thought what might have been a few months. Not that Forrest gave us any illusions. Some kids take a year, some kids never get there. We were hopeful it might, because we went in May, we were hopeful maybe by the start of the school year things would have calmed down and he could come back to school here. But it was apparent that he couldn't. And he really didn't turn the corner, in my view, until
7 months.
Yeah, until Christmas.
Yeah, very end of November, early December it was about 7 months in when he really started to show any actual difference, I think. Any regret that, he wasn't with us. He was mad at us for a long time, of course, for taking him.
But he was still very entitled and stuck in his version of how things should be. And as soon as I get out of here, I'm going back to my friends, and you kept me from my friends. So we got all of that, just kept coming out. So we do the weekly therapy. Forrest would push his emotional buttons, try to get him, and not try to get him, but ended up with Dante in tears. And that was a good thing in our view. It was very hard to sit and watch, but he was tapping into something. But he was tapping something that he had never. He was going beyond his defenses, and never done that.
No, I think through the weekly therapy, and we're talking a year of that therapy, Forrest basically made Dante acknowledge that though he was not at all responsible for his early life and for probably what are some of the terrible things that happened to him, though he still has no memories of those. But now that he was a teenager, he was and needed to become fully responsible for his behavior, for how he treated his family members, how he treated his sisters, and how he treated his mom and dad, and also really what kind of a person he was and what kind of a person he wanted to become. And somehow Forrest managed to lay that out, and I would hear this usually week after week in such a clear way. I had never heard anyone lay that out to Dante before, but he needed to hear it that clearly. You know, he needed the sympathy. You are not responsible for what happened to you when you were a little tiny boy, and it was terrible, and we're so sorry about that. Now you are totally responsible for who you are and who you are becoming. And to have that with that much clarity, not responsible, responsible, somehow, eventually, after a number of months, it began to sink in, and I think Dante got it. I think he didn't feel as bad and as guilty about who he had become, because he had this, you know, this element that we were all acknowledging. It was so hard as a child, but he also felt like, okay, I did some bad things, you know, I was horrible to my sisters, I felt like punching my mom a couple times and got close to it and did in the shoulder and so on. He did a few things like that a few times. He had to acknowledge all of that. He had to acknowledge a certain amount of responsibility, a certain amount of guilt. And then I think eventually Forrest gave him a way to move beyond that and start thinking about, who do I want to become now? Do I want to be a better boy? There were certain key words and key phrases that would come up over and over and over. And we still use them, of course, now that he's been back for 4 or 5 months. One is family kid. You know, what should Dante be striving toward? Well, he should try to be a family kid. And that means a series of different things, but, you know, he's kind of aware of what that means in our family. It means sticking around and not ever running away. Running away was a major problem for him the year before he got into the Institute with Forrest. He ran away for a couple of times, 9 to 10 days at a time, and we didn't know where he was. Terrifying for us. That's when we asked social services to get involved, because we had no idea where Dante was and what was going on. He had a probation officer, but they weren't able to hunt him down and put their finger on him, and that's really scary when you have a kid who's still in middle school who's just taking off and disappearing and not coming back for over a week. It's just terrifying. So, you know, we were at our wits' end, and we finally had to acknowledge we are completely out of control with this child. There is nothing we can do with him. We contacted social services. We were so lucky. We stumbled really on divorce program, because I counted at one point, I think Dante had 7 different therapists before Forrest. And that was up to about the age of 12 or 13. And it started at supposedly 3. So, you know, that's not that many years to have that many therapists. And every single one finally ended up putting up their hands and saying, can't do a thing with him. He had spent a number of weeks in juvenile facilities in the juvenile delinquent program here in the county. One point, they kept him for 30 days, hoping to stop him from running away again. And literally 2 days after he got home, he took off again for a full week. So he was completely out of control, completely out of control. And somehow the combination in the Institute of putting him about an hour and a half away from our house, putting him in the country so that he had no idea where to run. He couldn't run away. There was no place to run to, but still able to see us, you know, for weekly therapy, hear about us all the time, and begin very slowly, I think, week after week and month after month, to actually practice how to be a family kid. That whole combination was the thing that turned it all around. But it took 7 months for him to begin to kind of see the light and get it in his head that he probably was going to have to acknowledge what he'd done and then start to actually change. So it was a long period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Took a lot of patience on our part and
Yes.
just faith that this was going to work,
Mm-hmm.
because we tried everything else,
Yes.
and it did, and it's sticking now. He's been out of the inpatient program since the end of April, and with us now, what's that, 4 months. He's doing well in the first few weeks of school, playing sports, definitely connecting at home, has a better group of friends. You know, he's respectful, responsible, and fun to be around, which are other key words that we learned in the
Yeah.
program. But he's hitting on all three, most of the time.
Right.
Can you tell me about your experience with the court system and what it was like when everyone figured out that the Institute is what worked?
I'm not sure everyone figured that out. The judge figured it out, which was great.
And his probation officer.
His probation
Yeah.
officer did. Social services supported us in sending him there, but not without a struggle. But I give him credit for making the right decision. And so, I think it's new to them, to all of them. They weren't sure what this was, but what they could see was, and I think again led by the judge and his probation officer, because they saw him, and they would come into court, because he'd have regular hearings, and say, he's doing well up there. He's playing football. He's getting all C's, and he was flunking last year. And he's making progress, so let's leave him in, because progress is good. And so it was gradually, he stayed in the system. The whole time he was in the Institute, he was also appearing in court every couple of months. And so everybody had eyes on, and they began to see that, well, for this kid, this is really working. And they knew that this was a kid who was totally out of control, because he had stood up to probation officers, the cops in the courthouse, he had told everybody off. He told Forrest off the first day he met him in very colorful language. So, and when he would appear, he would be calmer, visibly calmer, and the reports were that he was doing well, and so they eventually learned that, hey, this is working. Then the probation officer, Maurice, was so impressed that he invited Forrest up to do a presentation to all of his colleagues in the department, because he wanted them to know that this is another tool in the arsenal here that can work with our kids. So they don't have a lot of successes.
Mm-hmm.
So.
When Dante had been in Forrest program for about 2.5, close to 3 months, social services started pushing him. They said, he needs a home visit. He needs a home visit. You've got to send him home. We've got to begin to get back to his home environment. And we were very leery of that, but they were pushing pretty hard. So we went up and we picked him up. He hadn't been home for close to 3 months. Brought him home on a Sunday morning, and he was very quiet, and he was very taciturn. He was very watchful, just checking everything out. And after a few hours, we had a little alarm on his bedroom door so that we could hear if he had opened or shut the door. And we had a nice meal. We did some family activities and games together. The late afternoon, he said, can I go in my room and listen to music for a few minutes? And we said, yes, sure you can. So he went into his room. We turned on the alarm. He put on his music. Literally 5 minutes It took him 5 minutes. He opened the window. It was in the middle of Sunday afternoon. He'd been here for a few hours at that point. He went out the window and down the street, and the alarm was incredibly loud. I think the whole neighborhood knew something was going on. And he took off. And Rick went out and hunted for him. Didn't find him in the neighborhood. Didn't find him. They came back, got the car, drove around a bit, tried to go past some of his friends' houses and so on. Didn't find him anywhere. Turned out Dante had jumped on a bus. He took off. He went to another community about 35 minutes away. We didn't know it at the time. He ended up being there for 9 days, and we were not able to find him. And, we just felt horrible, of course, because he was gone again under our watch after all of 4 hours. And I think that really brought the message home to social services that this is not a process you're going to rush. And no matter how much they wanted, to see that kid back in the home, out of their system, clearly it wasn't time yet. It simply didn't work. So we were just plain lucky that one of the police officers was in a fast food place out in this other community, saw a kid getting some food, and had heard that this boy, Dante, whom they knew, they'd seen his picture, they'd come across him before, people were looking for him, and he literally took a photo of Dante on his phone and sent it in to the Justice Center right here in our community. And the two guys talked and said, yes, pick him up, get him. So they approached him. He claimed he wasn't Dante. He said, no, I'm he used one of his friends' names. I'm Eric, he said. And they picked him up and brought him back and immediately took him back up into Forest program. And then he was there until, for the next 4.5, 5 months, until Thanksgiving Day, because it hadn't worked to send him home. So the next home visit we had him for was literally for a Thanksgiving meal. We took him right back up the same day, and that was a totally different experience. He had a wonderful time, and he was polite by that time. He was pleasant. He stood and helped me peel potatoes and, carry the dishes to the table and check the turkey, and went out and played basketball on the driveway with all of his friends. It was great. That was a great visit.
That's nice. If you had to give one piece of advice to parents who are in your situation, what would it be?
Well, I'd say you got to connect with the right people to help them, and most of the ones you'll find who are very well intentioned just don't know enough, and that's from the psychiatrists down to the therapists. So make sure you find the right people. Make sure you get a good mental health diagnosis, because a lot of these kids with attachment also have these mental health issues, and with Dante we had to get that clear first before we could get to the behaviors. So find the right program, find the right people, and we certainly did with this program, with the Institute.
And the other thing I would add to this, and this is a very controversial issue, I think, but I'm just going to put it out there. I would say, and this is a personal point of view of mine, but the piece of advice would be, don't give up. And I understand that there are parents in this world who truly have gotten to the end of their rope and felt like they absolutely had to give up. They had no choices left. I think we were lucky, and I think that we stuck with the process longer than some people, even when we felt a little desperate, because, we had this boy whom I loved dearly in our house for 9 years before we found the right program, and they were 9 tremendously difficult years, but I simply wasn't going to give up. And Again, no judgment on folks who absolutely have had to. I understand situations are different sometimes. But if you can stick with it, and if you can keep looking and looking and looking, then there is a chance that you might find something that will work. Because giving up, and that's it. You can't go back once you give up on a kid. That's it. Yeah. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.